Part 6. Aztec. Those who fed the sun with blood, their empire was built on water, on stone, ... and on fear. But from that very place, we also see the burning desire for immortality in the human heart. Some cities rise from valleys. Some empires are born from rivers. But the Aztecs, they chose to build Tenochtitlan right in the middle of a lake. I still remember standing in the square of the Templo, Khmer, once the religious heart of the Aztec. Now, only ruined foundations and stairways remain. But if I close my eyes, I can hear the drums, the long whistles of priests, the roar of the crowd offering gifts to their gods, not gold or silver, but blood. The Aztecs believed the world was not permanent. The sun did not rise each morning by natural law. It needed to be nourished. The only food powerful enough to keep the sun alive was the human heart. To us, that is horrifying, but to them, it was sacred. This was not a savage society. It was a society with laws, art, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, and even poetry. But at its center was a very different cosmology. The world was always on the brink of death. And so, sacrifice was not just a duty, it was a glory. The Aztecs didn't call themselves Aztecs. They were the Mexico descendants of a migrant tribe from the north. Legend tells that they were led by the god Huitzilopochtli and were given a sign to found their capital, where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. They saw this sign in the middle of Lake Texcoco. They began to build their floating city. Tenochtitlan, the city of stone and water. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they were stunned. Bernal, who chronicled the conquest, described Tenochtitlan as the Venice of the New World. Canals, floating bridges, great markets, wide squares, all orderly, clean, and vibrant. I have stood on what remains of Lake Texcoco. Now the center of Mexico City tried to imagine the small boats paddling through the canals, carrying corn, cacao, flowers, and people chosen for sacrifice. People who did not scream, because for them, it was to be chosen. The Aztecs did not wait for war. They waged it to capture prisoners, to serve their sacrificial rites. Every battle was a hunt for people not to destroy, but to harvest for their rituals. It's hard not to call it terrible, but it's also hard to deny that tin their eyes' blood was not a disgusting thing. This was the pulse of life. And then, that life was cut short, arrived with fewer than 1,000 men. But he had allies, disease, internal divisions, and the Aztecs' blind belief that the white men could be returning gods. Tenochtitlan resisted. It was not easy. It was driven from the city on the night of La Noche Triste, the sad night. But he returned, this time with more indigenous allies. And when he laid siege a second time, it was no longer a battle. It was the dismantling of a civilization. The city was besieged for months. The people starved. The water became polluted. Finally, Tenochtitlan fell, not because their gods abandoned them, but because the people no longer believed in their gods. I once touched a sacrificial stone that remains, its surface worn smooth, as if centuries of blood and rain had dissolved it. I wondered how many people had lain upon it. What makes a society accept such a thing as a matter of course? The Aztecs did not fall because they were savage. They fell because they had built a world too enclosed in its own beliefs. When reality changed, they could not tour, would not change with it. And yet, they left a legacy. The Nahuatl language is still there. Many words Mexicans use today, from chocolate to tomatuar, of Aztec origin. Their culture was destroyed, but not erased. They still exist, in the language, in tattoos, the beat of festival drums. In the memory of an entire people who never forgot that they were once warriors ... of the sun. Now we will leave the Valley of Mexico. We travel north, where the desert meets the mountains, and where a strange culture left its rock carvings in deep canyons, but never built cities. The ancestral Puebloans, the people who built their homes in the cliffs. Part 7. Ancestral Puebloans. Those who built homes in the cliffs. Not every civilization builds an empire. Some just build shelters, strong enough to withstand time, but also fragile enough to dissolve into the wind. I stand before a blazing red cliff in Mesa Verde, Colorado. Beneath a fold in the rock is a cluster of dwellings square, solid but tiny, amidst the majestic natural landscape. Cliff Palace is the name that Europeans gave this place. But for those who once lived here, it was no palace. It was just home. Home skillfully carved into the cliffside. Home roofed with timbers carried from afar. Home nestled in the heart of the rock, as if humanity were trying to burrow into Mother Earth for protection. They are the ancestral Puebloans, or, as they were once called, the Anasazi, though that name is now rejected for its derogatory connotations. Their ancestors had lived in the Four Corners region for thousands of years. They didn't build giant stone temples. They didn't wage wars of expansion. But they left behind something more profound, a way of life in balance with nature, and a social network more sophisticated than its simple appearance suggests. I once followed a trail leading into one of the ancient stone villages. The stairs were hand-carved notches in the rock. Inside, there were rooms just large enough for one person to lie down. The floors were dug deep, keeping them warm in winter and cool in summer. At the center of each complex was the kiva circular, subterranean ceremonial chamber where people gathered around a fire, told stories and passed down knowledge through oral tradition. No written language, but memory. No monuments, but ritual. And no kings. Only community. The ancestral Puebloans were masters of social organization. They built canal systems to grow corn in the desert. They traded across the Southwest, exchanging everything from turquoise and coastal seashells to tropical bird feathers. They left behind thousands of homes made of adobe, stacked stone, and pine wood throughout the canyons. But then, around the 13th century, they left. The entire regions of Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and many others were abandoned. No war, no scorched earth. They just ... left. I remember sitting in an ancient kiva whose roof had collapsed. The wind blew in from the cliffs, light and dry. There was no trace of death or violence, only dust. But for that very reason, their disappearance is all the more haunting. Researchers have proposed many theories: a prolonged drought, an environmental imbalance caused by deforestation for timber, internal tensions, or perhaps they simply migrated, breaking into smaller new communities, continuing to live, continuing to exist, but no longer as the ancestral Puebloans we know. The important thing is not that they disappeared. It is that they never truly disappeared. Their descendants, the Hopi, Zuni, and Acoma peoples, are still alive today. They still tell the old stories. They still weave patterns from ancient symbols. They still regard the stone dwellings as sacred places, not because they are beautiful, but because their ancestors once lived there. A Hopi person once told me, "We are not an old civilization. You're just people continuing on the old path." I look back at the small chisel marks on the cliff, face the traces of hands that once held stone hammers, that tapped against the mountain, that created a roof for their families. They are not heroic, but they are full of tenderness. And I think not all civilizations seek greatness. Some civilizations only seek a place to live, and then that silence. They outlasted many thunderous empires. Now, from the cliffs of the American Southwest, we will journey further to the land of snow and the northern lights. A place where long ships once cut through icy waves, carrying swords, sagas, and ruin. The Vikings. Part 8. Vikings. Those who sought the world and lost themselves. Not all who cross the sea go to conquer. Some cross the sea just to see the sun rise from another place, and sometimes never return. I've stood on the west coast of Norway looking out at the silver-gray ocean and imagined a Viking longship from 1,000 years ago. Dark wooden planks and dragon-headed prow slicing through the fierce waves like an arrow of Thor. On board were not just warriors. There were also people carrying their families, their beliefs, and a nagging doubt. Did the land ahead truly exist? We often know the Vikings through a simple image: raiders, horned helmets, battle axes, and violence. But in reality, they were a complex civilization, a blend of explorers, traders, farmers, and poets. From the 8th to the 11th century, the Vikings crossed the oceans from Scandinavia, landing all over Europe, reaching as far as the Arctic, down to the Black Sea, and even setting foot in North America centuries before Columbus. This was not just a series of raids. It was an expansion of living space, a search for new lands, a thirst for survival in a cold, harsh world. I once stepped into a reconstructed longhouse in Iceland where light filtered dimly through cracks in the wooden planks. No electricity, no glass windows, just a fire pit in the center and a turf-covered roof to keep in the heat. But in that house, people once told stories of Ragnar, of Odin, of the chosen death that led to Valhalla. In Viking culture, death was not to be feared. What was fearsome was to live an unworthy life, a life of fighting, adventuring, and enduring. That was the way to enter the world of the gods. So why did a civilization that once spread fear across Europe quietly disappear? They didn't exactly disappear. They melted into other things. The Vikings weren't destroyed. They were assimilated. When they accepted Christianity, they abandoned much of their Norse mythology. When they settled in England, France, and Ireland, they married local women, had mixed-race children, and learned new languages. The Normans, who would later conquer England in 1066, were descendants of Vikings. A fall is not always violent. Sometimes it is a dissolution, like ice melting in wine, like an old language being slowly replaced, like a legend being forgotten. I once read a passage from the Edis, the Norse epic poems, that told how, at the end of days, Ragnarok would come. The gods would die. The world would sink into ice and fire, and from the ashes, a new world would be born. Perhaps the Vikings always knew. All great things must come to an end. What remains is reputation. And if something is still told 1,000 years later, then it is still alive. Today, the Viking legacy is still there, in the names of many cities in England, in the structure of Nordic languages, in emblems, in art. But that spirit of wandering, of daring to set sail without knowing what lay on the other side, perhaps we only catch a glimpse of it now in the eyes of those who live by the sea. Among the rocks, the snow, and the gray skies. And I think perhaps the Vikings' greatest achievement was not where they conquered, but that they dared to set out in the first place. Now follow me. We will go to another land, with no sea, no forests, no wheat. A civilization that rose from stone and sand, once cast its reflection upon the banks of the Nile. Ancient Egypt, the builders of tombs for the soul. Part 9. Egypt, the builders of tombs for the soul. When other things collapse into dust, Egypt stands as a reminder that some civilizations do not just want to exist, but to live forever. You don't need a map to know you're arriving in Egypt. You just have to see the brilliant light flooding the sand, the dry wind blowing through the cliffs, and the silhouettes of giant forms rising from the desert like man-made mountains, and you know, this is the land of gods and dreams of immortality. I once stood before the Giza pyramids very early one morning when the sun was still as red as a glowing ember, and the stones still held the chill of the night before. There was no one around, just me, the sand, and a feeling of stepping outside of time. The ancient Egyptians didn't build pyramids to display power. They built them to guide the human soul across the threshold of death. To them, death was not the end. It was the beginning of another journey, longer, more eternal. And the pyramid was the first map on that journey. The Egyptian civilization spanned 3 millennia, longer than the time separating us from them. During that time, they built not only pyramids, but also their own language, an administrative system, religion, medicine, architecture, and a spiritual world so profound that modern people have only just scratched the surface. I remember once seeing a papyrus scroll up close, handwritten over 3,000 years ago. On it was the Book of the Dead spells, instructions, and invocations to help the soul navigate the pitfalls of the underworld. Each line was like a key. You could feel they truly believed in it. But they weren't just dreamers of the afterlife. They were people of order. Everything in Egyptian society revolved around the concept of mat, harmony, balance, and cosmic justice. From the pharaoh to the farmer, every action was judged by mat. And so, Egypt endured for so many centuries, not just through strength, but through stability. They didn't need to conquer far and wide. They were patient enough to wait for the Nile to flood in its season. And when the river overflowed its banks, they planted seeds, built temples, and recorded history in hieroglyphs as if they were writing letters to the stars. So what shook this eternal empire? The answer, as usual, is not just one thing. The fall came gradually, from without and within. The invasions of the Hyksos, Assyrians, Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. Each wave eroded a part of Egypt's roots. But before the swords arrived, the cracks had already formed from within. Pharaohs became detached from reality. Officials became corrupt. Faith in the order of Mat was eroded. When death was no longer sacred, life lost its foundation. I have stood in the Valley of the Kings, the burial place of the great pharaohs. There is no daylight. Only the beam of a flashlight on walls covered with images of the god Ra, the god Anubis, and symbols of the afterlife. The corridors seemed to bore straight into the earth, and I wondered, did they know, when they built these tombs, that one day people from another world, another language, another culture, would stand here rereading the words they once whispered to their gods? Egypt never truly disappeared. It just transformed. In religion, from the symbol of the Eye of Horus to the pharaoh's staff in the hands of Christian and Islamic figures. In language, through the Greek and Roman alphabets, and then to the alphabet we use today. In architecture, in the dream of eternity. When a civilization dreams of immortality and is mad enough to build it in stone, then even when it shatters, the fragments will endure. And now we will leave the desert. We will travel east, where the ancient jungle swallows time. To a civilization that had its own writing system, astonishingly accurate astronomers, and a sudden disappearance. The Maya. Part 10. Maya. Those who recorded time on stone. Some civilizations leave behind temples. Some leave behind legacies of conquest. But one civilization left behind a calendar. I remember the feeling of first stepping into Tikal, of the largest Maya cities, on an early morning, when mist still clung to the layers of leaves. Amidst the hypachide calls of toucans and the sound of the wind sweeping through the forest, a stone tower gradually emerged through the haze. It was not as majestic as the Giza pyramids, nor as covered in bas-reliefs as Angkor Wat, but it stood there tall, straight, silent, like a giant cosmic clock hand. The Maya were not a unified empire. They were a network of city-states, Palenque, Tikal, Calakmul, each with its own king, its own patron gods, and its own history. But they all shared a single worldview. The universe was an endless series of cycles, with no beginning or end-only cycles. For that reason, the Maya didn't just build temples. They built cosmic clocks out of stone. Their calendar is one of the most complex and accurate systems ever to exist. The long count calendar recorded time not in years, but in baktans, katans, tons units, spanning tens of thousands of days. They measured time not by revolutions around the sun, but by the rhythm of the sacred. I once saw a Maya stela, up close in its intricate pictographic glyphs, like stone serpents winding around the sun. Each carving was not just a symbol, it was a belief that every day was an entity with a soul, and the order of the universe was maintained by understanding and respecting time. But the Maya were not dry astronomers. They were master builders. Their temples scraped the sky in the middle of the jungle. Their stairways led straight to the heavens, and every architectural detail served a cosmic purpose. Twice a year in the spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun's shadow slithers down the steps, making the stone serpent Kukulkan seem to come alive, crawling down the temple. Science, art, belief. The three were one. So, ... Why did a civilization that could observe Venus, predict eclipses, and build stone cities in the jungle collapse? Once again, there is no clear moment of ending. The Mayan decline was a long, slow process of deepening silence. Archaeologists suggest that climate change is severe drought combined with the overexploitation of resources led to the collapse of their agriculture. Social tensions, wars between city-states, and a loss of faith in the political systems, which depended on the divine authority of kings, caused the people to abandon the great cities. Not destroyed, not conquered, just abandoned. I once stood among the moss-covered steps as a light rain fell, and I thought, these are not the ruins of war. They are the ruins of weariness, as if an entire civilization sighed, ... and retreated into the jungle. The Maya did not disappear. Today, millions of Maya speakers still live in Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. They still maintain their customs, rituals, and even follow the old calendar cycles. For them, the collapse was not the end. It was just another cycle. There is one strange thing I will never forget. In 2012, when many around the world feared that the end of the Mayan calendar meant the apocalypse was coming for the Maya people themselves, It was simply the time to begin a new cycle. I think about that a lot. Perhaps what the Maya truly teach us is not astronomical calculation or the art of stone carving. It is a reminder. Everything comes and goes, but nothing is ever truly lost. It all returns. In another form, now continue with me. From the Mayan jungle, we will return to the legendary lands of the Mediterranean where poets, philosophers, and warriors created an empire for the ages only to dissolve in its own golden light. Ancient Greece, where the gods once spoke in human tongues. Part 11. Greece. Those who forged gods from thought, they did not conquer with the sword. It expanded their influence with words. And even as they crumbled, their echo still rings in our minds. I have walked on the ancient stone-paved streets of Athens where every stone seems to have heard the debates about the nature of the soul, of justice, of love, and of death. Nowhere else in the world makes you feel that thought itself can be a legacy. Ancient Greece was not a unified empire. Like the Maya, they were a network of city-states, polis each, with its own regime, its own laws, and its own cultural identity. Athens with its fledgling democracy and love of knowledge. Sparta with its iron discipline and austere militarism. Corinth, Thebes, Delphi. Each a world in miniature. It was this very diversity that created the miracle. A civilization in constant dialogue with itself. I once sat on the stone steps of the theater of Epidaurus where the acoustics are so perfect you can hear a whisper from the stage dozens of meters away. Here the Greeks didn't just watch plays, they were confronted with themselves with tragedy, with guilt, with remorse, with destiny. Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, they didn't write for entertainment. They wrote to heal as a collective ritual. And then there was philosophy. Socrates walked barefoot through the streets, asking simple questions that shook the entire city-state. Plato wrote down the dialogues as a way to immortalize wisdom. Aristotle laid the foundations for logic, biology, politics, aesthetics, for nearly every field of Western thought that would follow. The extraordinary thing is this. They didn't force anyone to believe. They asked, debated, and doubted on. From that uncertainty, a civilization rose. But Greece was not just about ideas. They were warriors, explorers, storytellers, builders, from the Parthenon temples to the statues of Apollo. From the myth of Achilles to the Battle of Thermopylae where 300 Spartans stood against a Persian army of thousands. They combined beauty and death, ideals and action. They created gods who reflected themselves, the amorous Zeus, the wise Athena, the wild Dionysus, the cold Hades. The gods in the Greek world were not perfect. They were complex. And that is what made them more human than divine, and more divine than human. So, why did such a brilliant civilization decline? The answer lies in their very structure. Fragmentation. There was no unity. Athens and Sparta, two opposing poles, confronted each other in the Peloponnesian War that lasted for nearly 3 decades, rather than cooperating. The war exhausted their economies, shattered their trust, and left all of Greece vulnerable to outside forces. When Alexander the Great rose from Macedonia, he conquered the Greek world. But he himself was the final and ultimate product of its thought. After him, Greece fell into the hands of larger empires, Rome, then the Byzantine, then the Ottoman. I have stood at the foot of the Parthenon where the broken white columns still proudly hold up the blue sky. Under the harsh Athenian sun, you don't see ruins. You see the traces of a beauty that remains whole. Greece never disappeared. They live on in the architecture of theaters, in systems of logical thought, in the concept of democracy, in aesthetics, in mathematics, in poetry, in music. When you ask the question, what is true, you are speaking the language of the Greeks. Now, we will leave the Aegean Sea. We will journey to the land that rose in Greece's shadow, an empire that would inherit its legacy and then consume the ancient world. Rome, eternal on paper, but whose fires also one day went out.